Hi, I'm Dr. Kurt Woeller. The title of this mechanisms video is Chronic Stress and the Cortisol Awakening Response. So this video is sponsored by Integrative Medicine Academy. To access information about all of our mastery courses through Integrative Medicine Academy, you can go to integrativemedicineacademy.com. You can also email us at integrativemedicineacademy@gmail.com. This is our disclaimer for the content of this video, and this is for educational purposes only. And so let's get into the topic. I need to put my glasses on. So I want to talk about, first off, what is the chronic stress response? So this is a particular slide. This is a particular slide that I've used in many of my lectures over the years, showing that there are various potential sources of stress that all of us are exposed to. That could be anything from environmental exposures, mold, chemicals, heavy metals, changes in the climate, changes in what we're being exposed to, both within our home, outside of our home, electromagnetic frequency, for example, food, chemicals in our food, chronic infections, digestive problems, and then it gets into aspects of mental, emotional issues, anger, fear, worry, anxiety, sleep problems, all of it. So what ends up happening, though, is that the chemical changes that occur in the body are translated through activity in the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will then communicate with the pituitary to stimulate something called ACTH, which is a hormone that then stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. Now, there's typically a negative feedback, meaning when we have enough cortisol released, that signals to the hypothalamus to turn off its signal to the pituitary gland, and we get a downregulation of the effect. The problem with chronic stress, wherever it's coming from, is a constant input, a constant stimulation of the pituitary, then to the adrenals, then through cortisol output, and we run into problems over time. That could just be energy production issues, osteoporosis, breakdown of protein, salt water retention, and then effects on the immune system. So pick your condition, whether it's allergies or fatigue or headaches or autoimmune conditions, etc. It all at one level can be linked back to this chronic stress response. Now, it's not all related to cortisol. Of course, we're going to have effects through adrenaline and noradrenaline production as well through the adrenal medulla. But cortisol is important because cortisol is a regulatory hormone in the body, and particularly at the cellular level. Now, much of it has to do with how we react to stress, these physiological changes. So it could go take food, for example, what we eat, how we digest, how we assimilate, how we eliminate. What do we do? Our occupation. Are we living or working in a toxic workplace? How we breathe, what we think, our perceptions. And then, yes, there are genetic aspects as well. So, that is inherent within all of us. But that's not, for most of us, an overwhelming problem. It's really our environment and what we do on a day-to-day basis throughout our lives. Now, the cortisol awakening response is a concept that links back to early detection of cortisol rises that normally happen right as we're waking up, and then within about 45 to 60 minutes thereafter. And for any of you who have done salivary adrenal testing, you know that typically most of the labs will have a 4-point detection where they look at morning, noon, afternoon, and nighttime levels. And cortisol is diurnal, meaning it gets produced at different levels throughout the day. So it typically peaks early morning, 7, 8 o'clock or so, and then it's at its lowest before bedtime, typically between 10 to midnight to 2 a.m. or something, or so like that. So it fluctuates. So cortisol rises normally in the morning, in essence, to kind of get us going, get the machinery of our metabolism going. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's in essence what the cortisol awakening response is all about. Okay, and so if we look at a typical 4-point salivary adrenal test, most again will look at morning level, noon, afternoon, and nighttime. What a cortisol awakening response does is it assesses cortisol output that's occurring in this earlier box within about 5 minutes of waking up, and then what is our peak output within 30 to 45 minutes thereafter. And it's important because the cortisol awakening response, relates to the predictable increase of cortisol that occurs in the morning just after awakening. And it is a manifestation of activity of the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis. Now, we get a rise in cortisol that occurs within a few minutes after awakening in response to ACTH stimulation. And then we get a transient additional increase of about 50% or so, approximately within 30 to 45 minutes. So the way I think of it is, it's as though we're putting the key in our car, turning the car, and we get that initial revving of our car engine, and then our car will generally settle back down into an idle position. So the car is useful assessment as it strongly relates to the overall HPA axis function, particularly with the anticipation of stress. So waking in the morning can actually be a type of stress test for certain individuals. So for example, if somebody has job-related or other perceived stress, that can often be translated into an elevated car reading on one of these profiles. And sometimes people with chronic fatigue, PTSD, or burnout syndromes oftentimes will have suppressed cars. Their car level will be very low in that first hour or so. And there are differing patterns for other conditions, depression, seasonal affective disorder, etc. So this is a typical cortisol awakening response assessment. We can see we have our morning, our noon, our afternoon, and nighttime, and then we have these other two measurements that are occurring in that first hour. And so our normal car response will show approximately a 35 to 60% rise in cortisol in that first 30 minutes or so. Okay, and then it will go back to that neutral position in what most of us have been used to measuring through a typical 4-point salivary adrenal test. Hypercortisolism, or elevated CAR, is often seen in states of perceived stress. So again, go back to that, I have to get up, I have to go to work, that's stressful, I have whatever it is, that perceived stress. Now, in some people, that will translate into elevated cortisols throughout the day as well. So we can just get this chronically elevated cortisol that occurs, and that can be detrimental because that can have adverse effects at the cellular level. Now, a hypocortisol state is what's called a blunted CAR. And a blunted CAR is where we're not getting adequate output of those first 2-point cortisols in that first period, that first 60 minutes or 45 minutes to 60 minutes, for example. And so it never rises up. It's almost like the car never really starts when you put the key in the ignition. Now, some people can have very low cortisol that would be linked to Addison's disease, or what's called adrenal insufficiency. But that's relatively rare. That's not something that we would typically see in our functional and integrative medicine practices. What's important to understand is the relationship between cortisol and other hormones, and cortisol and DHEA. Now, DHEA will typically rise in the early morning as well, to kind of match the cortisol to some degree, or at least maybe help buffer against it, because again, too much cortisol can have a detrimental effect, particularly long-term immune suppression, for example, and other things. So a lot of different health conditions, whether we're looking at endocrine function, detoxification capacity, neuronal health, musculoskeletal function and health, all can relate at some level to imbalances or balance, if things are working well, between the difference, or the relationship, I should say, between cortisol and DHEA. Now, for many people, inducers of ACTH, the pituitary hormone that stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, gets triggered by many things. It can be triggered by mental and emotional stressors, and that's a big one, right? That can be something that many people suffer with. Glycemic dysregulation, basically eating a diet that's very high in sugar, can be an overstimulatory aspect with regards to HPA axis dysfunction, and then tissue damage or inflammation. That could come from many things: chemical exposure, overexercise, toxic foods, chronic infections, etc. So really, for most people, particularly when you're thinking about this sort of cortisol awakening response aspect, mental emotional factors play a huge role. It's how we perceive an event rather than the event itself, although that can be important. It's the perception of the upcoming event that seems to generate a lot of stress for people. And then when there's a lot of stress, people often eat a diet that's very high in simple carbohydrates, other stimulants, over caffeine, for example, refined foods, just not eating healthy, and oftentimes not getting exercise or adequate sleep. And then everything else, right? Other things that we might be exposed to environmentally. Another interesting aspect of chronic stress through the flooding of the system of cortisol is dysregulation of the mitochondria. And the mitochondria play a huge role, more than just energy production, but they play a central role in cellular physiology and the normal regulation of cellular activity. So that is a topic I cover in many other videos. But just understand that an HPA dysfunction that's being driven by chronic stress response can have an adverse effect on mitochondrial function. Now, this information actually comes from our Functional Medicine Mastery course, and this is a very in-depth course into the fundamental principles of functional medicine. So if you want to learn more about what this course is all about, you can go to functionalmedicinemastrycourse.com. If you are interested in any of our other mastery courses through Integrative Medicine Academy, please go to integrativedmedicineacademy.com. You can also email us at integrativedmedicineacademy@gmail.com. We have courses like this one in functional medicine, toxicity, organic acid testing, autism, hormones, etc. So please reach out to us with any questions you have. Again, I'm Dr. Kurt Woeller. Thank you.